This video is now in session, and the Virginia gubernatorial election is currently going through the final stages of election campaigning. There's still a few months left, but now that we have the main candidates of Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin representing the Virginia ticket as the Democratic and Republican Party, we can start to get a sense as to how this race will go. So, for this election, Terry McAuliffe was the former governor of Virginia. Virginia does have a weird law stating that an office holder cannot serve consecutive terms, but they can serve as many terms as they want. So, for example, if Terry McAuliffe was first elected in the 2013 gubernatorial election, but in 2017 he was ineligible to run because that would be a consecutive term. But now that it's 2021 and it's not consecutive, he is now eligible to run, and that's why he did run, and now he's the Democratic nominee. Meanwhile, Glenn Youngkin, he used to work at the Carlyle Group, which is a private equity firm, and after stepping down, he announced his candidacy for the Virginia gubernatorial election. He won the Republican nomination by around 52%, 54.7%, compared to the second place candidate that got 45.3% of the vote. So now that we're in the general election phase, the main topic that's been talked about in Virginia is education. Education has taken a very big stance in this election, and it will probably take as big of a stand in the 2022 election, because a lot of things that happen in Virginia in 2021 translate over to what happens in the 2022 midterms. So for this race, a lot has been talked about education, including critical race theory, as well as how liberal education systems are, and diversity in schools, especially in selective schools like TJ, which is in the Fairfax area, and as well as admissions. Who should be admitted? Should there be a quota of minorities? Should we restrict Asian Americans from getting into college in favor of Black Americans, and so on and so forth? Those are the kinds of issues that have been talked about in this race the most. And with this, Glenn Youngkin has essentially taken the conservative stance, the kind of Tea Party stance at this point, which is that critical race theory must be banned, that education is too liberal, and as a result, it needs to become more conservative. It forgets conservative values, and as a result, you should elect me instead of Terry McAuliffe, who will try to put too much racy stuff into the education system. And that's his defense. And a lot of Virginian voters, especially rural voters and evangelical voters in Virginia, which there are a lot of, especially in Lynchburg, they heavily resonate with that kind of idea. Meanwhile, Terry McAuliffe wants to increase funding for teachers' wages. He wants to expand the curriculums to include more of Virginia's racist past, and he also wants to eliminate racial disparities in education. That's his main idea for the short and long term, and those are very contrasting ideas. And they're one of them is mostly the status quo. The other one seeks to challenge the status quo and go for a more conservative edge. And that's the main issue that's been talked about in this election, which education usually is talked about in elections, but typically they're not the center issue. They're not the most important issue. But because of the pandemic and because of the culture wars surrounding education, it's becoming a much bigger issue that Democrats and Republicans have both had to confound in these elections. So come 2022, we will probably expect more of this dialogue of education, and we should see education take more more of a prominent presence in the 2022 election because of the culture war started by conservative activists. So with these two positions, how do Virginians respond to Glenn Youngkin and as well as Terry McAuliffe? For the most part, Virginian voters at this moment are still favoring Democrats. If we look at the polls, which we always try to not try to stray away from the polls, but there isn't really much else to go off of. But for Poland, you can see these are all Republican pollsters, the Trafalgar Group, WPA Intelligence, both of them well-known Republican pollsters. But we see here in all four of these polls that Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat, wins out with the plurality of the vote. Now, the fact that Terry McAuliffe wins in every single one of these polls and is conducted by a Republican pollster indicates that Terry McAuliffe is doing pretty well. You could probably add 3%, even 4% in some of these polls to match more of the actual number that Terry McAuliffe has. But even though this will be a close election, since Virginia does have close elections, Terry McAuliffe at this moment is favored to win. But a dark horse for this race could be Asian Americans. And the reason why is strictly because of education. If we look at TJ Thomas Jefferson, that school, which is in the Fairfax area, where it's highly selective, after the George Floyd protest, they started to admit more black students into their school system. If we look through here. If we look through here, for decades, TJ has admitted very low percentages of black and Hispanic students, but after the George Floyd murders, the superintendent wanted to boost the school's diversity. So with that, there has been more diversity in TJ, but less Asians admitted into the system. So for that, a lot of Asian parents, especially Asian Tiger moms, they might start defecting over to the Republican Party, because we saw in the 2008 election that a lot of Asian Americans helped propel Barack Obama into the position of winning Virginia, which hasn't gone for a Democrat for a very long time until 2008. And then it kept going from there and from there on out. But the thing is, for the 2021 election with education, for the Asian American Coalition, a lot of the voter groups, especially those living in the suburbs, one of their priorities is education, which is having a good education system and having their children get into a good school. So with that, if these selective schools are not really prioritizing or if they're prioritizing more diversity, then that harms a lot of the Asian Coalition's goal, which is to get into good schools, to get their children into good schools, which is why that the Asian American voter group can be a dark horse, since a lot of them have voted for Democrats for the past decade. But with this new issue, many of them might defect over to the Republican Party. Now, it's only an if, like Glenn Youngkin has to actually act and provide a contrasting point in order to get Asian Americans to vote for him. But nonetheless, there are a lot of other issues that Asian Americans prefer Democrats over Republicans for, and that's why Terry McAuliffe still at this moment is the front runner in this race. The other thing about Glenn Youngkin that has been a sore point is his affirmation to Donald Trump. Originally, we saw Glenn Youngkin lean a little bit more moderate, especially compared to Amanda Chase, who was the Trump candidate of the 2021 Republican primary for Virginia. But during the convention, Amanda Chase was voted off by Republican Republicans who were allowed to vote in the convention. She placed third and was eliminated by the fifth round, and that's how Glenn Youngkin and Pete Snyder were able to get into the top two positions. But the thing is, Glenn Youngkin, ever since the Republican primary and ever since ever since his nomination was cemented in as the Republican nominee, he's gotten more and more towards Trump and his kinds of views. In fact, he's spoken more and increasingly about Donald Trump in favorable terms, which is not really a good idea for this kind of race. For this kind of race in Virginia, hadn't elected for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. And in 2016, you could arguably say that Virginia was a competitive state before the election happened. But when the election happened, Hillary Clinton still won Virginia, and that meant that Virginia kept staying Democratic since 2008. So with that, Virginian voters as a whole have demonstrated that they don't want Donald Trump kind of candidate. It's because they don't want Donald Trump. But because Glenn Youngkin is positioning himself more as a Trump candidate rather than a moderate candidate by tapping into the culture wars, by tapping into tapping less into the moderate economic policies of former Republican governors of Virginia, then you start to see a situation where Glenn Youngkin will not do as well as projected, because if he positions himself as a moderate candidate that would primarily focus on taxes and as well as on a few social issues, then that would have put him in a much better position. But Glenn Youngkin at this point is exclusively using social issues to propel his campaign, even though he used to work at the Carlyle Group, which should make him which should provide a really good precedent for him and his economic vision. Yet that's not what he's doing. So Terry McAuliffe, who was the governor of Virginia, has a much better recognition by the Virginian public to start off with, and the fact that he's portraying himself as a moderate gets him the votes that he needs in order to win in the election. If we look at the 2017 election, if this will load, Ralph Northam, who was the Democratic nominee elected into the governor's position, was able to win because of the Fairfax County area and because of the suburbs of Washington, D.C. By winning that area, Ralph Northam was able to win the 2017 election. The same thing with the 2013 election, when Terry McAuliffe won by barely a lean margin. You can see that he won mainly because of suburban voters in the Fairfax area. So with that, it's mainly a battle of the Fairfax area. The rest of Virginia is swayable, especially the suburbs of Richmond and as well as Virginia Beach, Newport News, and that area. But ultimately, Fairfax is what commands the Virginia politics these days, and it's likely to stay that way for the 2021 election. And as a result, Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin, both of them are heavily focusing on Fairfax, but with different views. So while Glenn Youngkin is if you're a Democrat, fortunately, playing into Trump politics, unfortunately, if you're a moderate Republican, even though he's doing that, it will still be a competitive election. And to end off, even though I know this isn't quite related to the candidates of Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin, Trump has already got himself into this race by sowing doubt into the Virginia election before the vote counting has even started, before absentee ballots have even been sent. Trump has already said that there might be irregularities with the Virginia election, which is why Republicans should look at vote counters in Virginia. But I mean, that's just Trump these days. He's most likely gonna just keep spewing out election election disinformation for the years to come, especially as he lost the 2020 election. But that's just that was just the thing I wanted to mention, just because Trump has gotten himself into this race. Especially with Glenn Youngkin being more supportive of Trump. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.